1 year later, Vernon and Petunia Dursley, who Albus Dumbledore had ordered to raise a recently orphaned Harry James Potter, had lost custody of Harry to Petunia's older brother Carlisle Evans and his wife, Mary, when they stepped in. Little did Lee know that when he took Harry in, he had deprived Dumbledore of his child soldier. If you thought Petunia and her brother Lee reconciled, because of their meeting at Lily's funeral, the reconciliation never happened. They still weren't on speaking terms, and Petunia found herself wondering if she should have fought harder for Harry, instead of allowing Lee to take him away. There was also the matter of Lee claiming that Vernon and Petunia were terrible people, who would mistreat Harry, as per Dumbledore's wishes. Plus, the letter that Dumbledore had given to Petunia was submitted to the court as evidence. That was enough for the judge, as she awarded custody of Harry to Lee and Mary, with limited visitation rights for Vernon and Petunia. Petunia shook her head, wondering what on earth she had been thinking to reach out to Carlisle Ariel Evans to help her take care of Harry. Despite everything, Lee and Mary took good care of Harry, as they read the contents of Dumbledore's letter, and were determined to give Harry the life that he truly deserved. At the same time, Lee and Mary decided to start their own family, and give Harry some much-needed siblings. When she was informed of that one night, Petunia and her husband laughed, knowing Lee was an idiot for marrying the wrong sort of woman. They saw Mary as nothing but a gold-digging witch who wanted Lee for his huge inheritance. There could be no way the mismatched couple would bring any children into the world. Yet, the Dursley family itself would get bigger than it already was. Shortly after the Dursleys lost custody of Harry Potter, Dumbledore sent another orphan boy named Patrick Harvey to stay with them. Patrick's parents Elizabeth and William were killed in the infamous wizard attack that killed Paul and Isabella Ulrich. As the Harvey family had no nearby living relatives, Patrick was sent to stay with the Dursleys. Petunia was not happy about that, as Lee had taken Harry away from her, and she wasn't allowed to visit him except on court-appointed days. Patrick, who had a mild disability, thrived in the Dursley household, much to Dumbledore's delight. Yet the old wizard had some other plans for the Dursley family, which would make them dependent on him, even if the Evans family wasn't. On the night of December 8, 1982, little Patrick and Dudley gleefully threw food at each other around the dinner table despite Petunia's efforts to stop them when Vernon showed up carrying a tiny girl with him. The baby was a year old and she had dark blonde hair, pale skin, and brown eyes. "Here's little Miss Agnes Parker," Vernon frowned as he set the toddler in a chair. "We're to be watching her for a while." "Where are her parents?" Petunia asked as she stared at the little girl. "Her parents probably abandoned her," her husband snapped. "Nobody knows who they are or why they left her here, but she's here nonetheless. The question now is, what should we do with her?" Just then, a flying piece of carrot thrown by Dudley hit Vernon on the nose. "That's enough, boys," he yelled. The two toddlers stopped throwing their food and stared at the huge man. "Now I want you to meet Agnes Parker. She'll be staying with us for a while." Dudley and Patrick stared at Agnes. The little fat boy frowned, but little Patrick smiled at her. "Hi," Agnes squealed, before sliding off her seat, and began raiding the cupboard. Petunia caught her and scooped her up, saying, "You can't go into the cupboard, not before I get your food." Agnes stared at Petunia as she fixed a plate of food and set it before the girl. She stared at the plate for a while, not knowing what to do. She and her family had grown up poor, and at the mercy of the wizards that had attacked their village. Petunia said, "It's no wonder why she came here." "Whatever do you mean?" said Vernon. "I heard that her mother was stolen by a wizard and her father was killed," said Petunia. "Plus, it's a matter of who her parents were and what they did. After all, they did try to help wizards, that's what I've heard." "You need to stop listening to all that gossip," Lee yelled as he showed up. "She's just a baby. A baby that was abandoned when her parents were either killed or taken away from her, said Petunia, and why are you here, Lee? Aren't you supposed to bring Harry here this weekend? I would, if Mary didn't have to go into the hospital, Lee frowned. Mary, his wife, had gone to the hospital to deliver their first child a few hours earlier, leaving Harry with a sitter. I believe that congratulations are in order. Vernon frowned as he handed the cookies to the children. I would say that, he said, but how will we know you aren't going to continue being a jerk? How will we? I think that's enough drama for tonight, Vernon, Petunia said as she gathered the children and took them upstairs to get them ready for bed. And as for you, Lee, she said to her brother, I'm sure that you'll be filing for a divorce and taking the baby and Harry before the next year is over. Like that'll ever happen, Lee scoffed, as he knew that Petunia was wrong. For the last few months, Petunia had told anyone who would listen that there was no way that Lee's marriage to Mary Lewis would last, not with his weak-willed nature and her cruelty towards men. Plus, Lee and Mary's adoption of Harry was seen as a great thing, as Lee and Mary appeared to be better parents to Harry than Vernon and Petunia would ever be. Yet, something big happened that would change everything. The next day, Vernon returned home with two small boys. That's little Jonathan and Adrian Trickenberg, he said to Petunia. Don't ask about their parents, they are dead. Their grandmother is currently in a hospital and their grandfather, well, you can guess where he is because I don't know what happened to him. Petunia stared at the boys and said, let me guess, we'll be watching them for a while. Indeed, Vernon frowned as he set the boys down and plopped down into his easy chair. Petunia stared at Jonathan and Adrian for a few moments before going to the kitchen to make dinner. Dudley, Patrick, and Agnes were put down for a nap just moments before Vernon came home. The little boys went to explore their new home. Unlike their old house, which was little more than a playhouse full of disaster, the Dursley house was clean. Much too clean. That would soon end, thanks to Vernon's so-called generosity. After Jonathan and Adrian arrived at the Dursley house, a young man named Nicholas showed up, claiming to be the illegitimate son of Irene Ulrich and an unknown man. Petunia took one look at Nicholas and said to Vernon, that kid can't be her son. He's not? Vernon said in shock. Of course he's not, Petunia snapped at him. I should know. Irene only has one child, which is her son Sandy. There's no way that Irene could have had this boy. I see, said Vernon, but we can't send him away. We must find out who he really is and why someone is trying to pass him off as her son. They looked at Nicholas, who sat by himself in a corner and shook their heads. The boy was no Romanov, not with his odd looks, pale skin, brown hair, and brown eyes, and the fact he looked nothing like Irene or her son, who had dark hair and blue eyes. This would not do. Vernon and Petunia definitely had some questions to ask the social worker when she came to the Dursley house the following week. Meanwhile at Hogwarts, Dumbledore was attempting to get Willa Tyrell to return to her brothers and father, a request that didn't sit too well with his daughter and deputy headmistress a wife. Amber had repeatedly told her father that Willa's brothers were abusing Willa, and Minerva McGonagall refused to send Willa back to a potentially abusive household. Really, Albus, you must listen to Miss Tyrell, McGonagall said to him one evening after the girls went to bed. It would be nothing short of murder to send her back to a family that hates her. I wish for nothing more than for Willa to be with her family, Dumbledore tried as an excuse. His wife wasn't going to buy into that, as she refused to buy into his idea about him placing Harry with the Dursleys. She knew sending Willa back to the Tyrells would result in Willa's death, or something far worse. Dumbledore knew he wasn't going to win this round. Instead, he said, I hear that Lily Potter's brother and his wife are expecting their first child. Indeed, said McGonagall, but what strikes me as odd is those Trickenberg children and Miss Agnes Parker. Could they be related? Hagrid said as he joined the old wizards. Perhaps they could be royalty, Dumbledore said. It may be a rumor, but it is believed that the Trickenberg youngsters could be related to a royal family from Atlantis, said Hagrid. There seems to be nothing like that here. I'm not sure about that, said McGonagall. But you'll never know with those Trickenbergs. They seem to be bent on taking over the world by sheer numbers alone. Mayhaps Miss Agnes and Mr. Nicholas have a small part to play in the years to come, as does Jonathan and Adrian, said Dumbledore. Their Veiler will be among those who will help Harry Potter vanquish the Dark Lord. I won't allow any of this heroic nonsense about the children from you, Albus, McGonagall snapped. Miss Agnes, Mr. Jonathan, Mr. Adrian, and especially Mr. Potter will live normal lives and make something of themselves, instead of sacrificing themselves and correcting your mistakes. For once, I agree, Dumbledore said as he conceded. He knew Minerva would shoot down his attempts to meddle in the lives of Agnes and Harry. She would make sure they would have a normal life. But he had yet another trick up his sleeve regarding them. The next day, Carlisle and Mary Evans welcomed their first son, Robert Carlisle Evans, into the world. That date was December 10, 1982. While the Evanses played the part of the pleased parents and the Dursleys the happy relatives, the birth wasn't pleasant. Baby Robbie, as the baby was called, was born premature, and Mary nearly died, which should have caused a normal man to worry. Yet Lee showed very little concern about that, as he knew that Petunia was still begging him to take the children and leave Mary for a while. I swear, Petunia, if you don't stop telling me to leave my wife, I'm going to file a restraining order, Lee snapped as he glared at Petunia. So far, you have not shown any support of me and my family, and you also have the nerve to take in some orphans even though I had made it explicitly clear to the judge that you were not allowed to foster any children. Now that I have my son, it'll only be a matter of time before I have those kids and Dudley taken away from you. Petunia was shocked to see that Robbie didn't look anything like Lee. He had brown eyes and brown hair. It was apparent the Evans genes of blue-green eyes and red hair had skipped over him and the Lewis genes took over. Vernon and Petunia were sitting at home after the children were put to bed. Lee was with them. Petunia said, I can tell you aren't too happy with little Robert. I'm not, said Lee. I know why, said Vernon. Robbie's magic, isn't he? Well, I can't say you got what you deserved, after all the hurt you gave to your sisters when you walked out on them. Oh, so we're back to that again. Lee snapped at Vernon. I don't know why you married Petunia, seeing as she was more suited for Severus Snape than for you. And why would you name your firstborn Dudley? At least it's better her than naming him Faith, or Purity, or Rainbow, said Vernon, yet Lee laughed at him. Why would anyone name their kid Dudley? That poor boy is going to be picked on when he goes to school for getting such a terrible name. And Robbie? Petunia began to say. At least Robert is an appropriate name for a boy, said Lee. But as for Harry, come on. Lily could have done better than to give him such an old-fashioned name such as that. On that same day, a basket was pushed behind the bickering men. Vernon turned around and opened the basket, revealing two small babies both about Robbie's age. They were crying. He then noticed a card on their blankets. It read Ginger and Twyla Mobley. Not this again, he thought to himself as he stared at the two babies. They apparently didn't have any parents, or anyone else who could take care of them. Just then, Lee noticed the basket full of crying babies and said, So, someone else abandoned their kids, eh? Thought they would drop them off at your house. I'll take care of these two, if you don't mind. But what about Robbie, said Petunia. He was born not too long ago. You already got your hands full, and besides, I'm here to help, said Lee. Harry appears to be a handful, especially for someone who dumped him on you and I took him away, and don't get me started on those other children you have. As for Harry and his newly adopted sisters, They lived their lives not knowing they would become involved in the Second Wizarding War. Not only that, but Harry would also take control of his life and deliver a blow that would shatter the Dark Lord's hold on the wizarding world. At the same time, Willow would have to choose between staying with her family, who would gladly make her life a living nightmare, and abandoning them and going to Hogwarts. Everyone in the wizarding world would soon have to choose between preserving a dying way of life, or creating a new world.